I am clearly not Greg Barton. Unfortunately, Greg is not able to be here because he has had to isolate as being a COVID close contact, but he and his family are fine. So I am Associate Professor Anna Halafoff, also from Deakin University, from ADI, and I'm a sociologist of religion. So I'd just like to begin by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people. We're meeting today on their unceded lands, and I'd like to acknowledge all the elders past, present, and emerging who may be with us here today or listening via Zoom. So it is my pleasure to introduce our speakers today on the topic of Ukraine and the Russian invasion. So we have three esteemed guests, and the format of tonight's event is I will briefly introduce each speaker, who will talk for about 5 to 7 minutes. And then, so basically the first half hour, then the second half hour, I will facilitate a discussion with the speakers. And then the third half hour, we will open it to the floor for a Q&A. And people who are listening on Zoom, unfortunately, because of the technology, and fortunately, because Julie has been able to join us via Zoom, so we have Julie here on the screen. We will be asking people at home to just please put their questions in the chat, and Andrew will be moderating that chat and asking questions on your behalf. All right. So we're going to begin tonight with Dr. Robert Horvath, who's a senior lecturer in politics at La Trobe University and a specialist on Russian politics. He's the author of Putin's Fascists, Ruski Obraz, and the Politics of Managed Nationalism in Russia, published by Routledge in 2021. And his book examines a neo-Nazi organization that became a major force on Russia's radical nationalist scene in 2008 to 2010. He is also the author of Putin's Preventative Counter-Revolution, also published by Routledge in 2013. And this was a study of the program of reforms and repression that transformed the face of Russian politics during Vladimir Putin's second term as president. So welcome, Robert. Thank you very much for making the time to be here tonight.
Thank you very much. Is this working now?
Yeah, you might just have to look at.
Okay, wonderful. Well, today I'd like to begin with 3 points about Putin's war against the people of Ukraine. The first is that this war has nothing to do with NATO expansion or with anything that the West has done. This myth of NATO expansion is something that's been propounded by the Kremlin propagandists, and it's been supported by 2 sets of Western commentators who know almost nothing about Russia or Russia's internal politics. On the one hand, it's been propounded by Putin apologists on the anti-imperialist left, and on the other, it's been advocated by academic specialists in Western universities who are specialists in IR, so-called realists like John Mearsheimer. The historical record shows that there is no correlation whatsoever between NATO's actions and Putin's aggression. NATO has not expanded towards Russia since 2004, and during the past decade, the only countries to join NATO have been 2 great military powers that Putin obviously should be terrified of: Montenegro and North Macedonia, both deep in the Balkans, both a very, very, very long way from Russian borders. In fact, if you are looking for a driving force for NATO's expansion, you need to look at Russian aggression. The two wars in Chechnya, the razing to the ground of the Chechen capital Grozny, were a vital stimulus for the stampede of East European leaders wanting to join NATO in the 1990s. And Putin's invasions of Georgia in 2008 and Ukraine in 2014 were a basic reason why NATO today regards Russia not as a friend, but as a real enemy. The second point that I'd like to make today is that this war is directly connected to Russia's internal politics, to the survival strategies of a kleptocratic dictator. You can't understand anything about Vladimir Putin's conduct on the international stage if you ignore the fact that he is a kleptocrat, that he is a leader who for over 20 years has used his position of authority to enrich himself, to acquire billions of dollars in wealth, wealth that is not possessed by his own people, but by himself. And he needs a smokescreen, a patriotic smokescreen to conceal this. Putin's aggression on the international stage is central to this smokescreen. Every step of Putin's conduct on the international stage has been connected to the consolidation of his personal rule, of his personal dictatorship. From his cyber war against Estonia in 2007, his invasion of Georgia in 2008, to his invasion of Ukraine in 2014, and the annexation of Crimea, Putin's attacks on Russia's neighbors have gone hand in hand with his subjugation of his own people. Every act of aggression has been accompanied by the mobilization of supporters and by the suppression of his domestic opponents and critics. And my third point today is that Vladimir Putin is not fighting Nazis in Ukraine. Ukraine has a Jewish president. It has amongst the lowest levels of anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe, and the far right in Ukraine are politically marginal. The far right got about 2% of the vote in Ukraine's 2019 parliamentary elections, much less than in most of Europe, indeed much less than in Australia, where Pauline Hanson's One Nation got more than twice that in 2019. If there is any European country that has a problem with fascism, it is Putin's Russia. Under Putin's rule, the Russian state has cultivated a whole menagerie of neo-fascists, from neo-fascist intellectuals like Alexander Dugin to hardcore neo-Nazis and skinheads, to the election monitors of Sisimo, an organization created by neo-Nazis to offer the Kremlin election monitoring services for fraudulent elections in Russia and the entire post-Soviet space, through to the Rodina Party, a nationalist party which has one deputy in the Russian State Duma, but which is nevertheless a significant social phenomenon and enjoys a lot of exposure in the Russian state media, through to the Nightwolves Motorcycle Club, which is a paramilitary mass movement with an obvious fascist dimension and a personal relationship with Vladimir Putin. Neo-fascists have a regular presence in Russia's public sphere. They work in trolling factories like the Internet Research Agency, and they've played a prominent role in media coverage of the current war. Perhaps Russia's most celebrated war correspondent is Dmitry Stieshin, a journalist for Komsomolskaya Pravda, who is today, as we sit here today, he is disseminating lies about the Bucha massacre. Stieshin is a hardcore neo-Nazi. He's a former member of the Kremlin-backed neo-Nazi organization, Ruski Obraz, which I've recently published a book about. None of this is surprising. for an autocracy like Putin's, neo-Nazis are really useful. Unlike mainstream nationalists whom Putin represses, because mainstream nationalists tend to support the idea of free elections. They believe the nation should have some kind of a voice in who rules them. Neo-Nazis reject elections. They reject the idea of human equality and one person, one vote. However, neo-Nazis want to penetrate and colonize state institutions, and Putin has let this happen because it serves his interests. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Robert. So, Julie, we're going to turn to you next. Our next speaker is Dr. Julie Fedor, who's a senior lecturer at the University of Melbourne School of Historical and Philosophical Studies. She obtained her PhD in history at King's College, Cambridge, and she is the author of Russia and the Cult of State Security, the Chekist Tradition from Lenin to Putin, in 2011, published by Routledge. Co-author of Remembering Katyn, Policy Press, 2012. Co-editor of Memory and Theory in Eastern Europe with Palgrave Macmillan, 2013. And a contributing co-editor of Memory, Conflict and New Media, Web Wars in Post-Socialist States, published by Routledge in 2013. Since 2015, she has been a general editor of the Journal of Soviet and Post-Soviet Politics and Society. So thank you, Julie, for joining us this evening.
Thank you very much. Is my audio level volume okay? Can you hear me?
Yeah, it's pretty good. I don't know if it could be just maybe a little bit higher, but it's pretty good. Yeah.
Okay, I'll try to speak up. So thank you very much for that kind introduction, Anna and Greg, for the invite and for organizing this. And thank you everyone for coming along. In my little introduction, I would like to start by kind of bringing up front and center the fact that while we are all fortunate enough to have the opportunity to gather and talk in safety and without fear, Ukrainian civilians are dealing with the horrific reality of this hideous war that Putin's regime has unleashed and that is destroying lives as we speak. And I hope that going forward, we'll find ways to amplify Ukrainian scholars' voices, to listen to Ukrainian voices about the war, and eventually also to be involved in supporting Ukrainian efforts to rebuild once the Russian occupiers have been expelled from Ukrainian territory. So this war is in many ways the logical culmination of various processes that have been underway in Russia for some years now. And I want to focus here on one of these processes in particular, and this is the building of a powerful state media propaganda machine, which has succeeded in delivering some important and deeply destructive messages. So it has been successful, for example, in disseminating, reinforcing the notion that Russia is encircled by enemies intent on literally wiping Russia off the face of the earth. So the notion that Russian identity, Russian survival is radically under threat, and that extreme measures must be taken in order to combat this threat. The Russian state media has also been engaged in systematic dehumanization of Ukrainians, arguably for many years, but especially since the Euromaidan, the Ukrainian Revolution of Dignity, and then the so-called Russian Spring of 2014, the annexation of Crimea, and then also the Russian aggression in the Donbass. So we have seen systematic manufacturing of hatred, contempt towards Ukrainians, including through the dissemination of the image of the Ukrainian as having intrinsically Nazi tendencies. and also the related image of Ukrainians as kind of puppets of the United States, as traitors to their Russian brothers who have kind of sold Russia down the river and allowed their country, Ukraine, to be used as a launch pad for the West's operations aimed at destroying Russia. So these kinds of enemy images have been really relentlessly hammered home to Russian TV audiences in particular for years. We can trace them back further to the period following the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, 2004, and further still to the Soviet period when the KGB crafted this sort of trope of Ukrainian bourgeois nationalism and Ukrainian Nazism. And the KGB was heavily involved in propagating these stereotypes and images across the globe. In the Putin era, we have seen the routine labeling of Ukrainians as not real human beings, but zombies. This is a kind of one of the latest forms that these images have taken. Zombies whose historical memory has been excised and who have forfeited their very humanity through their disloyalty to Russia. So all these enemy images and myths about Ukraine, including also the entirely false claims that that Russian speakers in East Ukraine are threatened with genocide. All these myths are now being used to frame and to justify the mass murder of Ukrainian civilians. And there has recently been an especially sort of ominous shift in the discourse. So if at the beginning of this war, the full-scale invasion, denazification was initially about the aim of Ukrainian regime change, so just removing the leadership, we have seen in recent weeks and days a shift in the propaganda messages towards the idea that the entire Ukrainian population needs to be denazified. Alongside this, again, for years now, the Putin regime and its media machine have fostered a climate within Russia itself, so an atmosphere in Russian public life in which war and violence have undergone a significant degree of normalization. So, for example, political murders, other forms of violence have become relatively unremarkable, and the use of force and military aggression presented as entirely acceptable policy options. So journalists routinely ask questions like, to quote you an article I read just yesterday, they asked one particular neo-imperialist writer, what's your vision? Where in the future might our country apply force, just like in Georgia and Ukraine? Which of our neighbors is causing us the most concern? And indeed, Putin views as an important trump card his willingness to wage war, his willingness to tolerate casualties among his own soldiers. Putin and various Putin-aligned commentators say explicitly that they view this as a crucial advantage that Russia enjoys in the confrontation with Western governments and societies, with their sort of dominant civilian sensibilities, casualty aversion, and general pacifist moods in society. Finally, on this topic of the role that propaganda has played in the war, I would note also that this has now resulted effectively in the creation of a kind of parallel universe. You've probably read that there are multiple cases emerging where people are reporting that their Russian relatives simply do not believe that the Russian army is bombing Ukrainian cities, civilian infrastructure, or even that they believe that the Ukrainians are bombing their own cities. We don't know how widespread this is. It's certainly not universal. Of course, plenty of Russians have access to reliable information, know what's going on, but it certainly is at the very least a significant phenomenon. The images that have come out of Bucha and other locations near Kiev in recent days, these images of this really unspeakable violence, are likewise being widely dismissed as fakes, and often as fakes that have been supposedly produced in order to prepare the ground for a Western genocide of Russians. This is one of the messages that's being disseminated, that this is actually all about a kind of prelude to a Western genocide against Russians. So that's just a brief introduction to one particular aspect of this extremely challenging situation in which the world finds itself currently. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. And our final speaker is Dr. Filip Slaveski, who is a lecturer in Russian and Soviet East European history at the Australian National University and a senior research fellow with us here at ADI at Deakin. He is the author of Remaking Ukraine After World War II, The Clash of Local and Central Soviet Power, published by Cambridge University Press in 2021, and also author of The Soviet Occupation of Germany, Hunger, Mass Violence and the Struggle for Peace, 1945 to 1947, also published by Cambridge Uni Press in 2013. Filip has also just finished a book with the renowned Ukrainian historian Yuri Shapoval, provisionally titled Defying Stalinism in Death, The Case of Alexander Shumsky, and that will be published soon by Harvard University Press. Thank you, Filip.
Thank you, Anna, for inviting me and for everyone for coming. I guess what I can offer the two very contemporary analyses of the war is perhaps a broader historical context to help understand what's happening. I had a set of notes prepared to discuss for about 5 or so minutes. They're no longer relevant, partly because overnight I found out that the areas in which I'd been conducting my fieldwork in Ukraine for the past few years had been potentially the sites of massacres. So I've been scrambling, trying to find out whether or not people were alive. Turns out they are, and after some interesting discussions, it sort of occurs to me that what Putin's, or what the regime is doing, was certainly unexpected, and in some cases new. But in another sense, it's also the end of a long tail of Russian and Soviet behavior toward Ukraine. And I'd start from the 20th century, moving on. And in that sense, what Putin's doing is not particularly unique. And the roots of his behavior, but also of the way in which people in Russia understand what is happening, are not just new, and they're not just viable because of propaganda, although that's clearly a major point. For instance, the places where I did my fieldwork were massacre sites in 1944 under the Germans. They were massacre sites in 1937 and 1938 in the Soviet mass purges under Stalin, and they were sites of severe purging and hunger in the famines of 1932 and in the destruction of the Ukrainian political elite around that time as well. And as my friend had told me, we've just added another date to that long history of the resume. There are serious differences in all of the contexts that produce these types of massacres and conflicts in these areas, but there are also some similarities. Putin published a historical essay in June, I think it was, where he talked about the creation of Ukraine as a sort of fake country, the result of Lenin in the establishment of the Soviet Union, establishing a concession to Ukrainians of creating a country that never existed. The book that I've just written with Yuri Shapoval, who until recently was a refugee from Ukraine, looks at this in the early chapters. And based on the archival sources that we have, it's quite clear that, that Putin's version of history, and that's shared by so many Russian nationalists, is not accurate. And the reasons why it's not accurate, I think, establishes a link between what's happening back then and what's happening now. And I'll try and tease that out in a couple of minutes. if you call people like Putin a great Russian nationalist, in previous years they might have been called a great Russian chauvinist. And for people like this, there can be no great Russia without little Russia. Little Russia, Mala Russia, is how these people refer to Ukraine as a territory integral to Russian history. Its inhabitants are little Russians. Those who are not, to put it as bluntly as I can, are enemies that throughout the 19th and 20th centuries have been labelled as different types of enemies depending on the broader historical context. In the 1920s, they were Petlurists or Pilsudski's prostitutes. They were fascists in the 1930s after Hitler comes to power. They were fascists then in the Second World War and afterwards. The name ascribed to them isn't particularly important. What's important, I think, is what it signals. So in this viewpoint, which is not only restricted to Putin, something that is shared among a generation of people who are run parts of the country, people who support the regime, which are numerous, is this idea that Ukraine, after so many years of being a sovereign nation, has become dangerously rebellious in different ways, given its search for Western protection, Western integration. It's time to bring it back into the fold. And for all of the really important things that are happening at the moment in terms of timing, in terms of the internal social and political problems within Russia that Julie and Robert have discussed, that longer tail, that longer propulsion is certainly evident in what's been happening, and not only now, but 2014 and before that. So that's something that I can sort of talk about in more detail as we go on. I think we run the risk of, if we focus simply on Russia and not on a broader historical context and a broader geographical context, of sort of arriving at a predetermined conclusion that the regime's the regime's gone astray, it's acting irrationally. And I think that's also dangerous. Robert, you mentioned that this has nothing to do with NATO expansionism, and I think you're right in the contemporary sense, that if we look over the past 30 years and the grievances of a Russian political class, and also among many people in that country, about the collapse of the Soviet Union and the failure of reorganization of the geopolitical context in which they lived, a sense of betrayal, that Cold War structures in the West remained, particularly NATO, even though the reason for their existence in the Warsaw Pact collapsed. And the sense that that chance of Western integration for Russia, which had been promised and was not realized, was a betrayal. And that sort of thinking is not just Putin. And so when Putin talks about, this rubbish about, NATO coming and bombing and all that sort of stuff, yes, it's rubbish, but it touches on a deeper sore point in a way in which he can speak to his constituency that might seem silly from a Western perspective, but in that part of the world makes sense. And if we dismiss that as nonsensical, I think we run the risk of not simply understanding, but painting almost, back in Soviet times of, Russian society today as completely insular, people not understanding what's going on, people being tricked. Yes, that's certainly a part of it, but there are deep, and from the Russian perspective, legitimate, genuine problems that the geopolitical order after the collapse of the Soviet Union has not resolved, and are causes for major concern. Now, that, of course, does not mean that they go in and kill civilians in Ukraine, which they're doing. But to understand this conflict, I think we need to unravel some of the less comfortable and more complex elements. Denazification, demilitarization. Funnily for me, I wrote books on this in the Soviet context, and I know what they meant then. What the Putin regime means by these things now, I'm not sure, because they change every day. They've gone into Ukraine, and many Western commentators have said that their initial military objectives were not reached, so they're returning to focus on East Ukraine. I didn't know what the original military objectives were. I'm not privy to that information. And so I think it's really difficult and really dangerous for analysts to try and make sense of problems based on their initial assumptions. And that's happening on a widespread basis. From one perspective, they were always concerned with the East. So all these things are happening, much is unseen. And I think the best we can do today is try to make sense of some of the contemporary and historical problems as they're emerging before us. And as Julie had said, and as some of us are doing now, to give voice to a history of Ukrainian attempts at statehood, which have been thwarted by Soviet and Russian actors for numerous reasons. I'm happy to go on, but I think I'll probably reach 7 minutes.
Thank you, Philip, and thank you to all three speakers. So I'm just going to pose a few questions that you are all free to answer, or perhaps one or two of you would like to answer. So first of all, I actually want to thank you, Julie, for drawing our attention to the suffering in Ukraine and to our relative privilege sitting here in Melbourne, Australia at this time. I think academic forums are grossly inadequate with dealing with actually issues of trauma and emotion that are part of war and part of violence. So I just want to hold that space for a moment in the room and acknowledge that suffering and that trauma. And my first question then is about, could you all perhaps speak a little bit more about, you touched on it at the end, Philip, and Julie and Robert also, of course, mentioned to some degree, but more specifically on Zelensky and Ukraine's strong resistance to Russia at the moment, and also Russian civil society itself, like opposition to Putin at this time.
Yeah, one thing that I think that the conflict dramatizes is the contrast between a society that has a functioning and flourishing civil society like Ukraine, a society that has self-organized networks, which means that society is able to cooperate, it's able to organize humanitarian initiatives, it's able to share information, it's able to scrutinize what an invader is doing. And on the other hand, a society that is highly corrupt, a society where civil society has been pulverized. In Putin's Russia, since 2005, civil society has been the target of a war of attrition waged by the Kremlin. Every year, things get a little bit worse. In 2005, it was a NGO law that was justified as a way of ensuring Russia's sovereignty and preventing NGOs from being used by foreign interests. And every year since then, slightly more controls have been imposed. Fewer organizations have been able to function. And this process reached its culmination during the current war. The internal repression that Putin has unleashed during the past month has wiped out everything that remains of the independent media in Russia. The cable TV station Dozhd, the radio station Echo Moskvy, the newspaper Novaya Gazeta. For the past 10 years and more, those institutions were like an enclave of civility and rational thought and free debate for Russian liberals and for every Russian who wanted to live in a freer and less corrupt society. Today, they are gone. Some of those people are continuing to communicate to Russians on YouTube and through podcasts, but as platforms of free discussion, as sentinels of civility and democracy, they are gone. And that is precisely what Putin needs. In their place, there is a propaganda apparatus, there are a mass of pro-Kremlin structures, some of which specialize in terrorizing critics. Organizations like the National Liberation Organization, which is headed by a deputy in the ruling party. I remember attending functions of Memorial, Russia's leading human rights organization. It's one of those organizations that's been banned in the past month. It was a symbol of Russia's effort to come to terms with the horrors of the Soviet past. It was a genuine grassroots organization, which, for instance, organized essay competitions for high school kids, which challenged the very way that history was taught in Russian schools, which is about memorizing what the textbook says and repeating its platitudes. The resulting essays by high school students were often about what had happened in a particular town in the 1930s to someone's great-grandparents, based on original archival research. They were an astonishing exercise in civic initiative from below. And the Putin regime's proxies, these organizations that it funds to harass independent thought, to harass independent voices. Several years ago, they were throwing rotten fruit and other objects at these school kids, teenagers, going to this award ceremony for the best essays. That really epitomizes what the Putin regime has been doing to its own people. It's been silencing the most humane voices and promoting the most vile ones. This is important for understanding what is happening in Ukraine now.
I think Robert's absolutely right in terms of the scale of repression and drawing that comparison between Putin's regime and successive ones in Ukraine. I wish I shared your optimism about corruption. But having spent, having the privilege of living in both countries before COVID, what's one of the things that are most striking, despite the differences, are the similarities, and that's a problem for what's happening now. After the Maidan Revolution in 2015, what we saw, and people in this audience can talk about this as well, is a sort of mirroring of legislation of repressive laws by the Poroshenko government and the Putin government, trying to outlaw certain interpretations of the past about the Second World War. The so-called memory laws. Strangely enough, my first book was threatened with being sort of removed from the shelves on this basis. The idea that there's only one state interpretation of the past, and those who diverge from that interpretation of this or that group being the heroes of this war will be subject to prosecution. So the problem in so many ways is that the corruption in Russia and the corruption in Ukraine can mirror. I mean, they both in many ways live under this terrible shadow of the Soviet past. But also until recently, this sense that the extreme versions of creating a past and claiming a present in Russia had to be copied in Ukraine and vice versa as part of the battle, part of the war, particularly since the first invasion in 2014. And that for me is a dangerous element that can re-emerge, as the Zelensky government's been a little different. Before the war, his rating was in the toilet, partly because of his failure to deal with or to help realize so many of the promises of the Maidan Revolution. I was there in 2014 and 2015. The optimism from people who are traditionally cynical about politics, about the ideas of this being the change that we've been waiting for, possibly with EU protection, and that never came. So it's the similarities and the cynicism that concerns me. As for what's happening militarily, I think that's, as I said, very difficult to know. But the threat of that type of repressive monochromatic understanding of history in the present is certainly, particularly in a time of war such as this, is certainly ever present on both sides.
Thank you, Philip. Julie?
Yeah, on this topic of civil society, I might just add to what Robert was saying, that the contrast that Robert mentioned between the vibrant, really impressive self-organization of Ukrainian society and Ukrainian resistance, the contrast between that and what we see in Russia, where there's been this intensified assault against civil society, is a really instructive one. And I think this also helps to explain one of Putin's miscalculations with this war, perhaps, because I think he's arguably, possibly unable to see clearly and to understand Ukrainian civil society or Russian civil society. There's an Estonian analyst who recently pointed out that one of Putin's blind spots is the fact that he apparently seems to assume that everything's under the control of the secret services and to underestimate the power of civil society. So he has this complete failure to understand the motivations of civil society activists. He'll just assume that project his own values, assume that they're puppets who are acting out of material motivations. Because of his tendency to see things through this kind of Chekist worldview, there have been important leaks indicating that the Russian regime invested a huge amount of money in trying to recruit collaborators in Ukraine on the ground in the lead up to the invasion. And partly because of the corruption of the Putin system, much of this money was simply stolen by those who were in charge of doling it out. So it's another example of how the corruption of the regime is sort of undermining this whole operation. Another contrast we might draw is within Russia itself, between the response to this war and the response to the first Chechen war, when you still had organizations in Russia capable of mounting serious critiques and serious resistance to the war, and you had organized groups of parents literally traveling to the war zone, demanding that their sons be sent back. And this is also a very kind of traumatic memory for Putin and for many members of the military establishment who talk a lot about this experience of the mid-90s and say that this is shaping their response to this war, to make sure that kind of discrediting of the armed services should no longer be possible in Russia, because that you need to have repressive measures in place to prevent this kind of activism from being possible.
Thank you. So, as a sociologist of religion, I must then ask my next question, which is about the role of religion in this conflict. So if the speakers could perhaps explain to us the religious significance of Kiev and Crimea, and also Putin's or the Putin regime's vision of Ruski Mir, the Russian world, and how religion and the Moscow Patriarch also is involved in this current conflict and the lead up to it.
I think Julie wrote a book on this.
Julie, would you like to go first?
I didn't really write a book on this, but I can talk first if you like a little bit about this. So then maybe if I start with this concept of the Russian world, or the Ruski Mir. So this is this kind of expansive definition of Russian identity, a kind of civilizational definition that incorporates the whole, East Slavic world, certainly. So Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia, and also is more kind of flexible because it's anybody basically who identifies with Russian culture can be part of this so-called Russian world. So this is a notion that's been around since the mid-90s, but it's gone through many different permutations, and it became elevated to official policy in 2008, and Russian governments tried to use it as a kind of soft power initiative. One of the big problems with it is the Putin regime's kind of utter failure to make joining the Russian world an attractive prospect for Russia's neighbors. On the topic of religion, I don't think religion has been a hugely important factor in this conflict. Certainly the Moscow Patriarchate of the Russian Orthodox Church has been a very important ally of the Putin regime, and especially since the kind of conservative turn in Putin's third term, following the unexpected wave of domestic protests in Russia in the winter of 2011-2012. And the Patriarch has been publicly supportive of the special military operation. But as I say, I don't think religion is a hugely important factor. A very high proportion of Russian population identify as Orthodox. I think it's something like, it's more than 70%. But this is more of a cultural identity rather than reflecting actual deeply held religious beliefs or practices. That's what I would say in response to that question.
Yeah, I think Putin's very adept at mobilizing religious structures to legitimate his rule. I think that's well established. He's not the first Russian leader. Do you go back to Peter the Great to do that? It does it especially effectively, though. And the history of collaboration between the Russian Orthodox Church, particularly its power structures, and even in the Soviet period, is well established as well. I wouldn't say it's a religious drive. This idea of make Russia great Russia. It need not be religious, although it has religious connotations at times, depending on the period. It's a deep nationalistic drive in Russian history that's intergenerational, that's shared, and as I stress this, not only among Putin and his regime, but among sections of the population. And in that sense, the type of, what is to us an unprovoked invasion of a sovereign country is interpreted very differently in that context. It looks very different. Ukraine is not a sovereign country in that perspective. It's a territory. Okay, it's a territory which can be dealt with in a way to assist, ensure, promote great Russian interests, as it has been throughout history. And so, it's not necessarily religious. It's much broader than that. That's my response.
Could I quickly come back on to just in response to Filip's point there on this topic of Russian great powerness? I mean, I think that notion of Russian great powerness is certainly very important in all this. But I also think, you know, one of the things to observe in the coming months will be the level of support among ordinary Russians for choosing greatness over being a normal, decent society. Do ordinary Russians buy into this? I am not so sure that they do, that they want to choose war over, you know, a peaceful, prosperous life. Yeah. So I mean, this is one of the big questions, and what the level of support for this kind of ideas are among Russian population, and it's something that's really difficult to study for a number of reasons. But certainly, we know that the regime is very nervous about how the Russian population feels about this. Hence, the fact that it's you know, that you get a 15 years in prison if you use the word war to describe the this war, for example. So I think, you know, Russian people have surprised the world before, and who knows, they may yet do so again, perhaps with their response to this war further down the track.
Regarding the question of religion and the war, certainly quasi-religious arguments are articulated on Kremlin talk shows by Russian civilizational nationalists. So these are nationalists who see Russia as a civilization and rather than a conventional nation state, and they place the Russian Orthodox Church at the center of their conception of what Russian civilization is. However, I think it's important to understand that this is merely one part of the cacophony of illiberal and anti-Western voices that are allowed access to the Putin regime's controlled public sphere. There are also anti-Western ethno-nationalists. There are anti-Western so-called Eurasianists like Alexander Dugin, who's recently been on TV. There are neo-Stalinists like Nikolai Starikov. There are communists. There is the so-called social democrat, Sergei Mironov, the leader of a Just Russia, who's also a fanatical anti-Westerner, and these people hold ferocious debates on Russian political talk shows, which are the basic format of Russian propaganda. They shout at each other, they scream at each other, they sometimes get into physical fights, but they agree that you can't criticize Putin about anything because the president is always right. They agree that the West is the enemy. They agree that the West is preparing for the genocide and destruction of the Russian people. But they'll argue about lots of other things. And these civilizational nationalists are part of that the menagerie of extremist voices who constitute authorized public debate in Putin's Russia.
If I just add something very quickly on this point of general support, absolutely, it's very difficult to know. What we know of the 2014 initial invasion was that there were degrees of support, but the invasion now is very different, and it's unlikely, I think, to elicit in the long term if it continues. And that gets to our next point about a possible settlement. But on these words, things like genocide and the claims, I think there's a few things happening here. When people like that use these terms and they speak about these threats and so forth, yes, I mean, they're speaking literally, but at the same time, they're using the type of language that's become quite common in the political debates across countries and societies in this part of the world very recently. If we think about the word genocide being used by Russian commentators and so forth, Many, if you look at it historically, is a reaction to the types of accusations laid against the Soviet government about genocide in the Second World War, and before that in famine and so forth. And so these words become part of a lexicon of cross-cultural and country debate about where these countries sit. So I don't necessarily take them literally. So when they say they're preparing for the genocide of Russians in Donbass, I think they're not necessarily talking about, you know, the type of genocide we'd imagine, but they're engaging in a type of literal sparring with, you know, Ukrainians, Poles, and so forth, who have been using this type of language about Russia historically. It's entered the lexicon. That they don't stop talking about the genocide in Kosovo. That is the Russians, the fake genocide in Kosovo, as providing a false justification for the cutting up of a sovereign nation. They've continually used that for 15 odd years to try and justify what they first did in Georgia, and now what they're doing. So for so many of these people, I think, who are using these terms, who are engaged in these types of debates, these cultural, intellectual figures, if you call them that, I don't take it literally. And it speaks to a longer history of these types of debates about what these things are, what they could be. That's instructive for understanding where they're coming from.
Thank you. Of course, there's never enough time. So I'm actually not going to ask my third question right now, but I'm going to turn it over to the floor. I think we'll take, Sylvia has a mic. So yes, if someone has a question, please stand, please introduce yourselves and ask the question. And then there's also some questions from the Zoom room.
I think there's a mic here. I'm assuming people can hear me. I'm told there is one from Zoom. Colin Long just asked, off the back of that conversation, how much does Putin deliberately try to cultivate the nativist far right on a global scale? He certainly gets support, Fox News, for instance, but how important is that to his ideology?
Thank you. Robert, do you want to jump in on that one? And then we'll go to Julie, I think.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, the Putin regime has invested vast resources in cultivating the far right around the world. This taken the form of financial support, that we're aware of a very large loan from a Russian bank to the French National Front. There have been exposés of plans for Russian financial support for Italy's northern leagues, and it is extremely likely that there has been a lot of financial support that we aren't aware of because it was covert. The Putin regime also supports more extreme voices through things like appearing on Russia Today as commentators. Often Western neo-Nazis and neo-fascists are invited as experts on geopolitics to comment about something happening somewhere in the world from a reliably anti-Western, anti-democratic viewpoint. The Putin regime also has made great use of figures from the international far right as election monitors of fraudulent elections in the post-Soviet space. There's a particularly notorious Belgian neo-Nazi, Luc Michel, who's the head of, I think it's the Eurasian Observatory for Democracy and Elections, which began monitoring elections in the former Soviet space. It now has a big operation in Africa, where it basically has people who write reports that sound like they're professional election monitoring reports, except they always say that fraudulent elections, undemocratic elections, are a model of democracy in action. And finally, there is the support that is paramilitary to violent elements. The Bike Wolves motorcycle gang, it's much more than a motorcycle. The Night Wolves gang is much more than a motorcycle gang. It is a large business empire and a network of security companies, and they offer Western far-right militants the training that is offered to Russian special forces, both around Europe and within Russia itself. So this is support that is financial, it is in the media, and it has a really dangerous paramilitary dimension too.
Thank you, Julie.
Yeah, I don't really have anything to add to that.
Okay.
All of that, yep.
Do we have another question, perhaps from the floor or from Zoom?
Thanks, Glenn Nichols, staff member at Deakin. Thanks for the information, it's great. How did we get it so wrong? We were calling Lukashenko in Belarus the last dictator in Europe, including the Russian space. What do we miss?
Well, I mean, people have been calling Putin a dictator in different ways for some time. I think it's a bit more complex. It's probably changing now in a period of war and a shift of society, as has already been discussed, far more repressive measures. But historically, I'd seen his regime as trying to balance different interests, corporate interests, military interests, and others, and him being so successful in doing so and carving out a position for himself for so long because of his capacity to do that. I never understood the Donbass conflict, for instance, as him simply pulling strings in eastern Ukraine. There was a kaleidoscope of different forces there until recently, and it was much more complex. And I think that was almost a good way of understanding his rule back in Russia. But that is changing, and it's probably been changing before the current full-scale invasion.
Julie, would you like to add anything, or Robert?
I think that there are several things that are important. One is that Western IR theorists who work on the assumption that a country's foreign policy is entirely determined by categories that those IR theorists have for explaining anything anywhere without considering the internal conditions of that country. Experts who have zero language skills and who've read 2 books about Russian history, and they, on that basis, they formulate policy recommendations. That has been a major problem. A second issue is the influence of Russian economic elites in the West. The City of London has been a major conduit for the laundering of corrupt money, but this is a problem for the entire West. And finally, there is Putin's skill in manipulating his Western interlocutors, telling them what they want to hear. During his first 2 terms in power, he was a real master in just, if he was having a meeting with representatives of the EU, he'd talk about how European unity was such a wonderful thing and he supported Horvarth. If he was having a meeting with Tony Blair, he'd talk about the third way. if he was having a meeting with George W. Bush, he'd talk about Christianity and George Bush would get to see his soul. These are skills that every mid-level KGB officer was trained in, telling your interlocutor what they want to hear. And for a while it worked.
We have another question from the floor.
Sorry for making all those noises. Thank you for your analysis tonight. Really, really good. My question is just about which way the youth in Russia could go. I think, extremely sadly, the immediate future is quite bleak. It would seem that you know, the protests, people going to meetings and things outside are primarily youth. They're also more likely to have a VPN and use their English or other languages to access independent information. Is there is there generational hope, I suppose, in terms of thinking about the way Russia could go?
I can respond to that if you like. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a real struggle going on for Russia's youth, for the kind of hearts and minds of Russia's youth at the moment, which is likely to get, you know, more intense. We still don't know how the latest spring conscription drive, which opened on the 1st of April, has been going in Russia. But I mean, one of the specificities of military service in Russia is that it tends to be young men from underprivileged backgrounds from the provinces who don't have the money to buy their way out of military service, who end up serving. And, you know, in the big cities, if people can, then they will find a way to bribe their way out of doing military service, because it is such a brutalizing and terrible experience, which is common knowledge. You know, despite the Putin regime's efforts to make military service more attractive via these kind of PR campaigns and so on, and they've been trying to make a transition to a professional army as well, but have not succeeded in doing that at this point. So still having to use conscripts. We still don't know what's going to happen when, as the news of the losses of all of these young men comes back to these regions of Russia where they have come from. But yeah, we certainly see lots of veterans organizations, for example, who I look at a lot, who are really trying to sell their services to the state as basically agents of indoctrination of young people, to try to win the young people away from Navalny or from, you know, Western influences and so on. Yeah.
Thank you, Robert. Yeah.
I think the one thing that is very important to understand about this generational divide is that the Putin regime has had a very hard time with getting through to young people because they don't watch Kremlin television. The average age for watching the Channel 1 news is I think something like 63. Young people aren't being exposed to these TV talk shows where people argue furiously but agree that the West is evil and that Putin is wonderful. It's clear, particularly over the past year, in the aftermath of the Navalny crisis, that the Putin regime is terrified of youth. The Navalny crisis was really important on two levels. One, it exposed to the world and to vast numbers of Russians that Putin was prepared to use banned chemical weapons to kill his most popular domestic opponent. So that was one massive blow. And the second blow was the Navalny's film about Putin's personal corruption and his deliriously weird dictator kitsch palace at Gelendzhik, with its marble staircases and its room with pokie machines and pole dancing. Half a palace for Louis XIV, half something for a mafia don. And that video has been watched 121 million times. Now, some of those viewers were certainly in the West, some of them were in the former Soviet space, some of them were Russian diaspora, but a massive number are within Russia and a massive number are Russian youth. Russian youth have responded repeatedly and in very large numbers to Navalny's calls to protest, and the regime has responded with propaganda accusing Navalny of wrecking the futures of youth by drawing them into his protests. It's also clear that the Putin regime launched a campaign to repress opposition youth. It's clear that local police branches were required to arrest a certain number of youth for the seditious action. And perhaps the most extreme example of this was a teenager in the provinces who was sentenced to a prison term for, on Minecraft, he built what looked like an FSB building and then he blew it up. And that was enough for a prison sentence. Now, that wasn't because the local police were concerned about Minecraft. It was because they had to fulfill the plan that had been set at the center because the regime is terrified of Russian young people.
If I could include Ukraine in the conversation, particularly Ukrainian society. One of the most marked features, probably in the last 10, 15 years, has been a new way of understanding Ukrainian history that's been widespread and propagated among Ukrainian youth in high schools and things, in some ways sharing parallels with what's happened in Russia, where the state takes a really active role in defining popular interpretations of the past and what it means for the future. And so, for instance, the idea of Soviet genocide against Ukrainians in the Great Famine of 1932-1933, the idea of Soviet occupation after the Second World War and the mass counterinsurgencies against Ukrainian nationalist forces. This was a severe, significant military conflict, much, in some ways, encompassing more civilians than we see now. So the idea that the state is taking an interest in battling for the hearts and minds of its youth is not restricted to Russia. There's more contestation, of course, in Ukraine, given what Robert's discussed as a different type of civil society. But again, it's important to understand these countries in relation to one another, rather than Ukraine sitting here minding its business and Russia just out of nowhere invading and killing people, which seems to be a popular representation in much of the media. As for the Russian case, I mean, Robert and Julie could speak about the Russian government's attempts to create their own youth organizations to inculcate people into this idea of Russian patriotism, nationalism, which have different varying degrees of success. I remember being, for a joke, in Russia a long time ago and being at a poll, a sign-up station for this group Nashi, and he thought he was he was German, and he thought it'd be a big laugh if he got up and he tried to join. And they said to him, you must. They said you must be Russian, but they said it in Russian. You have to be Ruski, not Rossiyski. So the difference being you must be ethnically Russian, not a Russian citizen. The fundamental distinction, and that's a good way of getting a sense of what that type of inculcation in Russian youth is about.
And Nashi, for anyone here who doesn't speak Russian, means ours. So we have a question from Zoom, I think.
Yeah, there were a couple questions, military-related questions, which I'll raise, and so it was really just one question comes from Messina. Can the Ukraine win and push back on Russian aggression, including in the Donbass? If not, should NATO become involved? Very direct question.
I think because we are running out of time, and it was so thank you for that question. It's quite similar to my last sort of question. So maybe we'll just pose them and then we can hear once more from each speaker. So the question, actually, I say it's my question, but it was actually Greg's question, is, how is this going to play out? How is this going to end, actually, Greg asked. In addition to what was asked in the Zoom room, Greg asks, Zelensky has said that he's ready to reach a negotiated agreement, but what are the acceptable limits of compromise? And then what do you think is a best case scenario of what's going to happen next? But also, what is the worst case scenario? And also, as the speaker asked, what will other people or NATO, what should they do or not do?
I can go first if you like.
Sure, thanks, Julie.
So I don't think, I don't place any hopes in these peace talks that keep happening. I think at this point, unfortunately, the Russian side has just shown itself to be completely mendacious and utterly sort of unreliable in these and lacking in all credibility in these peace talks. I also think that don't think that sometimes there are calls for Zelensky to be making compromises to give up parts of Ukrainian territory. I don't think that anyone should be making these demands of Ukraine at this point. In terms of the worst case scenario, there are unfortunately numerous catastrophic scenarios, and Russian propaganda gives us some indications of what these might be. They've been talking a lot about the prospect of chemical weapons being used by the Ukrainians, or of a nuclear power plant being blown up by the Ukrainians, and they've also been openly threatening to use tactical nuclear weapons, or even move to a full-on nuclear exchange. Best case scenarios have more difficulty answering that question. Maybe Filip or Robert have a more positive thing. I mean, perhaps Putin might decide that the risk of domestic unrest, military humiliation, economic collapse is too great, cut his losses, find a way to declare victory and withdraw. That's what I am hoping will happen.
Thank you, Julie. Filip, do you want to go next, and then Robert can finish?
Thank you, Anna. It's funny, for a war that was supposedly sparked by the fear of NATO membership, that that there's no chance of NATO coming into Ukraine's defense, for precisely the reason that it would risk a conflagration of the conflict with Russia. This isn't the first time that there's been significant promises of assistance to Ukraine from the West, from the EU, from NATO, and so forth, that have failed to eventuate to any significant degree. Now, it's a very difficult situation where Western powers are offering and sending arms to help defend Ukraine, but not providing the type of assistance that would perhaps make a decisive difference. And I'm thinking primarily of things that Zelensky had been calling for, like air support. I mean, everyone made fun of a Russian military column that was 60 miles long that ran out of fuel, supposedly, but no one bombed them. So what's their rush? And again, this touches on the bigger question of how do we analyze this conflict? Is it one where the Russian military is being humiliated? Well, poor conscripts being sent into battle is not new in Russian history, nor is poor training. In fact, these are marked features of Russian military expeditions, Soviet military expeditions. The problem is not how they stack up against these criteria of what a military should be. It matters how they stack up against their opposition. And to that extent, the Ukrainians have been in trouble. And it's not, you know, the tales, and I certainly hear them from my people there, of resilience. I mean, they're inspiring. But resilience only takes you so far against the mass and onslaught of an invasion. And my concern is that Putin is doing in as much as he pleases on the basis that he understands that he can go so far without eliciting the type of intervention that would cause him pain. And so there's that general understanding of what he can do. And he's been very adept over the years of finding the limits of what he can do without causing the type of, you know, serious Western intervention that's going to cause him problems. And my fear is that he'll continue to do this and find those limits in Ukraine. I think he's serious about making it a desert. It wouldn't be the first time in Ukrainian history that forces have sought to eliminate its infrastructure in such a way as to stop it from being a potential military threat. It happened twice, both sides, the Soviets and the Germans in the retreats in the Second World War. And my fear is that he will continue to do that with a degree of impunity until something happens or they're satisfied, and they'll focus on clamping down on what it seems they want, which is the East and the South. I hope that's not the case. I hope that these strangely uninspiring peace talks with people who have no interest in peace, particularly from the Russian side at the moment, eventuate into something, but a little bit like Julie, I don't have much hope.
Thank you. Robert.
Okay. I see no hope of a peaceful outcome as long as Putin rules Russia. I think Putin is today a very disturbed, a very paranoid leader who realizes that he is a global pariah, whose image for a very large part of his own population has been destroyed, particularly by Navalny, and who now has led his country into its worst military defeat since the First World War. I don't think he has any way out. He can't agree on a peace after having suffered this incredible humiliation added to the massive legitimacy problems he already has. He is maintaining control by the pulverization of civil society, by arresting opponents, by driving others into exile, but his regime has no future. As far as possible endings for this crisis, the most serious, as Julie has already mentioned, is nuclear war. Putin's made a lot of weird statements about nuclear war. His propagandists have made a lot of disturbing statements about how Putin's Russia has a kind of virility that the Soviet Union didn't have, because unlike the Soviet leaders who were opposed to nuclear first strikes and who made a lot of rhetoric about peace, Putin is prepared to wage war. He's prepared to use nuclear weapons. And Putin himself has made weird statements about, if a nuclear war happens, then we are all martyrs and we go to heaven, and the others, the rest of the world, won't even realize what is happening to them. He's psychologically equipped for an apocalyptic end to life on this planet. I think we are, right now, humanity is facing its greatest crisis in history. This is nothing like the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, when Khrushchev was restrained by a Politburo of old men and by a central committee of old men. The Soviet Union had lots of problems, but it actually had more checks and balances than Putin's Russia has today. As far as the best case scenario, we wake up tomorrow and the headline of the newspapers is Putin arrested, military coup, announcement of transitional government, Navalny released, elections in 3 months' time. But that's my hope.
Thank you very much to everyone, to all three speakers, to the audience, to everyone who has helped set this up, from Deakin Downtown and from ADI, to Andrew and Sylvia, to Greg for organising everything despite, I think he is here on Zoom somewhere. Yes, Andrew's nodding. Just two things to finish off. I believe we are going to have another session in about a month. Religion, we've got a religion, society and culture network at Deakin, and we will have a panel that will be speaking more about religion in Putin's war, Putin regime war on Ukraine. And finally, I think there probably is a way that we can send an email out to everyone who has registered, who's here and who is at home. We will circulate a number of organisations that are fundraising to help Ukrainians in Ukraine, Ukrainians who are coming to Australia. And Filip also mentioned to me the other day that many of us are already wanting to assist scholars who are at risk. And there are funds to help scholars come to Australia, be supported in Australia, but a lot of people clearly don't want to go all this way. So I do have now some links to colleagues of ours at universities in Lithuania who are already housing scholars. So we will circulate those links. They have fundraising pages as well. Thank you again to everyone. Good night.